And welcome to the Interim Joint Committee on Tourism, Small Business, and Information Technology. This is our sixth meeting for the interim session. I want to welcome everybody. And always, if you have a cell phone, if you would just turn that to silence or vibrate as we conduct our business today, that would be greatly appreciated. We do have a quorum today, so I'm going to go ahead and let Sasha call the roll.
Senator Boswell. Senator Funky Frohmeyer.
Present.
Senator Gardler. Senator Harper Angel. Senator Howell. Senator Mills.
I'm here.
Senator Storm. Senator Thomas. Senator Wheeler.
Here.
Senator Wilson.
Here.
Representative All.
Here.
Representative Baker.
Here.
Representative Dotson.
Here.
Representative Pfister.
Here.
Representative Frazier Gordon.
Here.
Representative Freeland.
Here.
Representative Fugit.
Here.
Representative Grossberg. My party's in here. Representative Heath.
Here.
Representative Kulkarni. Representative Lawrence. Representative Maddox. Representative Massaroni.
Here.
Representative McPherson.
Here.
Representative Pollock. Representative Reed.
Here.
Representative Roberts.
Here.
Representative Stalker.
Present.
Representative Tackett Lafferty. Representative Tate.
Here.
Representative Timoney. Representative Truitt. Representative Wesley.
Here.
Representative White.
Here.
Representative Wilson.
Here.
Representative Witten.
Here.
Co-Chair Wise.
Present.
Co-Chair King.
Present.
Co-Chair Pratt.
Present.
We do have a quorum. They note that Representative Grossberg is here. We called his name a while ago and roll, and he just walked in, so mark him present as well. Any introductions by any members? Yes, Representative Dotson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today I'd like to recognize the birthday of one of our state representatives, Mr. Bill Wesley. Happy birthday, buddy.
Representative Dotson, if you'd like to sing also, you're more than welcome to. Representative Wesley. Senator Frohmeyer.
I would like to acknowledge one of our speakers today is also one of our great mayors of Northern Kentucky, Dave Hatter. Glad to see you here.
Welcome. Look forward to your presentation here shortly. With that, we do have a full agenda for today, two presentations, but very excited about the opportunity. First, I want to call forth our friends from the Kentucky Chamber as well as the United States Chamber of Commerce that will be presenting about the challenges and opportunities for small businesses in Kentucky. Gentlemen, I know two of you are no strangers to this committee or to the hallways of the annex, but with your guest also, the former protocol is introductions of yourself. For the record, please, and then you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. John Cox with the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, Director of Public Affairs.
Tom Sullivan, Vice President for Small Business at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and married to a native Kentuckian.
And Charles All, Executive Director of the Kentucky Chamber Center for Policy and Research.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for being here today. And the floor is yours, whoever presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, always appreciate the opportunity to present before you. Again, I'm John Cox, and this is a key committee for the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce because nearly 70% of our business members are comprised of small businesses across the state. And from a personal level, one of those members is a small mom and pop that started about 40 years ago out of my parents' garage. It's called Thorough Graphic Signs. So we definitely care about small businesses, and we just want to thank you all for your continued work to support small businesses across the state. You know, by backing important measures to support workforce development, reduce or streamline government regulations, and improve our tax code. You're actively making Kentucky a better place and a more competitive environment for small businesses, so we can't thank you enough for that. But our goal today is to connect you with resources and information to gain a better understanding of the challenges facing small businesses both in Kentucky and across the country. So we're especially excited to have with us here today Tom Sullivan, who serves as Vice President, as he said, of Small Business Policy at the U.S. Chamber. Tom has years of experience working to advocate for small businesses, including serving under President George W. Bush as the highest-ranking government official charged with exclusively advocating the views and needs of small businesses. As Chief Counsel for Advocacy at the U.S. Small Business Administration, he was directly involved in more than 100 regulatory and legislative matters, testified frequently before congressional committees, and was a spokesman on economic conditions and entrepreneurship. So Tom's going to discuss the U.S. Chamber's important work to support small businesses, including the Small Business Index, which is a key resource for understanding small businesses in our country. And after we hear from Tom, my colleague Charles All will briefly discuss some new research and survey gathered by the Kentucky Chamber in partnership with the Siena College Research Institute. So this information will highlight specifically how Kentucky businesses are viewing the economy and government and what their top challenges and public policy priorities are. So again, on behalf of the Chamber, thank you for this opportunity. We look forward to the discussion, and I'll turn things over to Tom.
Thank you, John. So it is really a pleasure and an honor to be here this afternoon, so thank you for that. I'm going to present some information about how small businesses are doing and also how small businesses are doing certainly here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and hopefully we'll have a good dialogue about some of this material. First, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We are the world's largest business advocacy organization. We're celebrating our 111th year anniversary this year. We represent not only the interests of large and small businesses, but also the interests of about 4,000 state, local, and regional chambers of commerce. It's one of the reasons why I'm so happy to be here with Charles and John this morning, or this afternoon, excuse me. I really want to touch briefly on my host, Ashley Watts, and the unique positioning of the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce from where I work in Washington, D.C. There really is no stronger partner with us. And I say that because not only does Ashley Watts serve on our board of directors, she also chairs an exclusive group of the top 100 state and local chambers. It's a group called CCC 100, and Ashley was just named chair recently. Now, it goes beyond serving on boards and chairing committees. It goes into the heart of what we're going to talk about this afternoon, and that is the hard work that you all are involved with helping small businesses in Kentucky. It's the hard work having to do with workforce, the hard work having to do, obviously, with tourism and technology, other portfolio issues before this committee this afternoon. And I want to make sure that you know that the work goes on day after day, every day, with the partnership between the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and our friends at the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce. So with 3 million members, most of whom are small businesses, a little bit hard to call them up every week and figure out how they're doing. So how do we prioritize our agenda on behalf of America's business community? Well, we do it primarily through our work with Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, and then about 3,000 of Ashley's closest friends around the country. We also do it through a survey. MetLife sponsors a quarterly index. It's called the MetLife and U.S. Chamber of Commerce Small Business Index. And I wanted to share with you some of our most recent findings about how small businesses are doing right now. So first of all, and this may surprise some, I would doubt that it would surprise you, our last quarter index shows actually the highest rating since the pandemic. You may wonder, well, why is this? Primarily, it's because of 2 within the 10 criteria we ask small businesses every quarter. Those 2 things are small businesses' comfort with cash flow. Small businesses had a 9-point increase from quarter 2 to quarter 3 in that comfort level of cash flow. The other is actually an assessment of a small business's overall health. When you ask small businesses, hey, how are you doing? We saw a jump of 6 points between the second quarter and the third quarter. Those 2 of the 10 index items actually make that big jump on how high the index is right now. Other positive news, 71% are anticipating higher revenues over the next 12 months. That's actually unchanged from the second quarter. I do want to put a little bit of a caveat on the term revenues and the anticipation of more revenues, which is good, but the caveat is profits. When I say profits to all of you, you know that that means money that is poured back into the small businesses for growth. Unfortunately, not all of our legislative friends understand that, but I think you do. A recent study done by the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council shows that 52% of small businesses said that revenues are not keeping pace with inflation. And that's a challenge. So revenues are going up, but that doesn't mean that the margins are getting bigger. In fact, they're probably getting smaller. So I started with good news. Here's some bad news, and I promise I'll end with good news. So this is just kind of in the middle. First of all, when you ask small businesses how they're doing, generally speaking, it's positive. But when you ask small business owners, how's the economy doing? Outside of things they can immediately control, unfortunately, things get negative pretty quickly. And in fact, 43% of small business owners have a negative outlook on the economy compared to 33% who are positive. My boss, Suzanne Clark, who's the CEO of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, calls this secondhand pessimism. And it is a challenge. And that gap, unfortunately, is widening, not shrinking. 52% of small businesses, and again, this is not going to be a surprise to any of you, but 52% of small businesses rank inflation as their top challenge. This is 7 consecutive quarters where inflation has been the top concern. Now, when you dig in a little bit deeper into inflation, we have heard that salary hikes, wage hikes within inflation is the top concern for small businesses, paying more to attract employees and to keep the most valuable employees. All right, now we get back to some good news. This year, 2023, will be the third in a gold, silver, and bronze years of new business growth in the United States. It's really pretty amazing. I think that the reason for this is primarily because small businesses fix problems. It's really that simple. Now, of course, PPP money and stimulus into Americans where they're able to say, hey, I have a 40-hour-a-week job, but I've always wanted to be my boss. PPP money and other stimulus actually did allow for those individuals to leap into entrepreneurship and instead of working 40 hours, now log in 60, 70, 80 hours a week as their own boss, and they love it. So that is part of it, but I still believe that the biggest part of that uptick in business is that small businesses solve problems. And when in our life has there been a more condensed set of problems than when COVID hit? And the data actually back this up. The data show that right after COVID, so roughly 6 months after COVID, that huge spike that you see in the gray during monthly business applications, attributed primarily through transportation, logistics, and delivery. I mean, we love UPS, but how many packages can UPS deliver in a day? The answer is not enough. And when everyone started shifted to working at home, entrepreneurs swept into the economy to pick up that gap. And what we see is that data show that those new businesses then transitioned into other parts of a new type of economy. So we still are seeing record growth. 2023 is likely to be the second highest new business applications. New business applications that you're seeing on this chart are from when you apply for an employer identification number. And there is data that show that likely employer businesses, and this is how the census knows that these types of sectors are generally going to hire employees, that also is up. Most of the small businesses start as sole proprietors, but there are certain sectors that the Census Bureau believes will lead to employer businesses. Now you can see the business applications in Kentucky have gone up as well. I'm looking at some SBA data that shows between 2020 and 2022, there were 11,033 openings of small businesses, 10,100 closings. That is one of 3 record years of growth. This is my boss, who I referred to briefly before, Suzanne Clark. Early in January of this year, she laid out the agenda for American strength and really focused on acknowledging the uptick in new business applications, but then sending a very clear message that says we cannot kill the geese that are laying the golden eggs of entrepreneurship. And she identified that there is a tendency to have federal regulatory overreach that threatens that type of business growth, employment growth, and overall economic growth. And so she laid down an agenda very aggressive to say, we will stop inappropriate federal regulatory overreach. And there are a number of steps that we've taken with the help of a dynamite legal team that is taking several agencies to court. I'll highlight one rule of many that demonstrates what Suzanne Clark means about regulatory overreach that has to be stopped. It is an independent contractor rule that is proposed by the Department of Labor. The Department of Labor is taking lessons that were passed in California that penalize independent contractors and treat them as employees of their larger business clients. U.S. Department of Labor is taking that initiative, which is called AB 5, and trying to make it a national initiative. And realizing in my position that 83% of American small businesses don't have employees. They're sole proprietors. They are S corps. Realizing that this type of regulatory approach is an insult to those entrepreneurs, and actually telling those entrepreneurs from Washington, D.C., you're better off not being an independent contractor, is overreach. I feel a little bit passionate about this because my wife, until recently, was a sole proprietor, and she wanted to be a consultant for Boeing. She did not want to be a Boeing employee. And that same story is echoed by hundreds of thousands of sole proprietors around the country. And the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is going to do everything we can to stop Department of Labor's overreach. That's just one of many examples. One of the ways that we try to work with legislators is to bring in small businesses to tell their story, because there's really no better advocate than the small business owners themselves. And I say that to many of you who are, in fact, small business owners. But when the small business owners really have to work in their business, they rely on us. They rely on the Kentucky Chamber. They rely on the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to advocate on their behalf. And so what we tried to do is we try to ask these small business owners, what are some things that you would advise legislators to consider before trying to help? They came up with a Small Business Bill of Rights. I won't go through each one of the Bill of Rights, but really what it attempts to do is put on the eyeglasses of a small business owner while you're trying to come up with helpful policies. And again, I never think that any legislator is trying to destroy a small business. I think that people want to help, and legislators want to help, citizens want to help. But sometimes putting on the eyeglasses of the small business owner and looking through the lenses from their point of view helps making sure that wanting to help and actually being helpful coincide. And so we came up with these Bill of Rights to assist lawmakers in how to approach different policy concerns. We had our Small Business Fly-In last week in conjunction with the America's Top Small Business Awards. Anytime small businesses come to Washington, it's a good day, it's a good week. And we went up to Capitol Hill and tried to bring some actual case examples to our Small Business Bill of Rights. And the common thread throughout our visit with legislators was certainty. The small businesses need certainty. Now, whether it is having a Speaker of the House or whether it is convincing Congress not to shut down government, whether it is trying to convince Congress to keep the 20% small business deduction past 2025, all of these things were discussed in the lens that the small businesses have, and they insist that they need certainty in order to grow, in order to plan and actually grow their communities. Last slide before I turn it over to Charles. we're learning like all of you are learning. And at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, we're the world's largest advocacy organization, but we weren't necessarily providing resources to small businesses. I kid with some colleagues, if a small business had called us and said, how do I fill out a particular tax form? We would shrug and say, I don't know, call an accountant. That all changed during COVID. Chambers of Commerce, whether it was the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce or other chambers of commerce, were getting calls from their members, their small businesses, wanting to know what the heck PPP stood for, what the latest guidance was, what does EIDL mean, how do I get in touch with SBA, I need a loan, where's a banker? All of these questions came up, and we pivoted from being purely an advocacy organization to providing resources. And we are tripling down on providing resources primarily through our small business digital platform, which is called CO. CO receives about 20,000 visitors a day. We're going to reach 6 million visitors this year, second only to the U.S. government as far as responding to searches by small businesses for answers. It's something we're committed to do. We're committed to helping your constituents and certainly the members of the Kentucky Chamber and any small business that needs help. We're committed to getting those answers to them through our digital platform. So thank you for your time, and I'll turn it over to Charles.
Dr. All, before you present, we do have two members that have already requested questions. I think they're probably specifically for you, Mr. Sullivan, if we could get to those. Senator Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I've looked at some of the U.S. Chamber's policies, and I have a great concern as far as maybe what I perceive as the lack of patriotism amongst the United States Chamber of Commerce, particularly when it comes to border security, immigration, their advocacy for outsourcing or really more offshoring jobs in the United States of America. I think we all can remember reading about how the Disney workers were all laid off and forced to train their own replacements in India. It seems to me that most of these policies are focused on essentially driving down wages in the United States of America, which in many ways has driven down standards of living in large swaths of the country. And obviously just how high you can stack the dollars is not necessarily an indicator of how much you love the country. What is do you have any concern about the displacement of these workers caused by these policies and the trade agreements that have really hollowed out American industry?
So thank you, Senator Wheeler. First of all, I do have concerns about what I hear every day from small businesses, and that is that they need employees. I have tremendous concerns. And then it gets more complicated when you ask, well, what about qualified employees? Where is that as a priority from just simply employees? And Suzanne Clark has been very clear, is that in order to address the needs for a growing economy, we have to have more people willing to work in the United States. The only way to do that is through immigration reform. In keeping with that, and specific to your observation question, we are now actually committed to not only have immigration reform that brings in workers that will help our economy grow, we also are committed to making sure that we have border security. We believe that those things go hand in hand. They are not separate and distinct issues and priorities that have to work against each other. And so we are doubling down on the need for additional legal workers in the United States, combined with additional border protections that allow for our economy to grow responsibly.
Senator Thomas.
Thank you, Chairman Wise. And Mr. Sullivan, first of all, let me thank you for coming to Kentucky today. I really appreciate your presence and being here. Mr. Chair, first of all, I actually have two questions, if I may. Okay, thank you. But they stem from one branch, and that is that article after article, book after book I've ever read regarding business always talks about the number one problem that small businesses has is access to capital. That's uniformly been for years their biggest handicap. So I would like your opinion on two things. First of all, my wife is a small business owner, so she and I talk about this conversation almost daily. What is your opinion of the SBA doing direct lending? Because oftentimes banks are a barrier to small business as opposed to help, that they don't provide the adequate capital or capital at all to small business that's needed to help them get over the hump and get started on the road to prosperity. So I'd like to, first of all, my first question is, what's your opinion on direct lending by the Small Business Administration?
So, Senator Thomas, thank you for the question. I don't like the idea of SBA being a direct lender. And the reason why is because SBA is good at doing certain things. The U.S. government is good at doing certain things. Primarily, that is setting the guardrails under which public and private partnerships can flourish. And I don't think they're good lenders. I think that we are seeing an emergence of new types of lenders, whether that's community development financial institutions working better with banks than they did pre-pandemic, or banks realizing that their best bets are small businesses like your wife's. So I think that there's incredible opportunity to expand the pie in lending, but I don't believe that in that equation, SBA doing direct lending will be helpful. I think actually it would not work out very well.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And as a matter of fact, your answer related to my second question. I see Kate back there because we just had a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and I talked about CDFIs. As a matter of fact, I'm actually having meetings in Lexington over the next month with members, with individuals to talk about CDFIs and to talk about, as a matter of fact, I talked today at our previous meeting about the state small business credit initiative. My second question is, how do we get information out to these small businesses? Because they don't have the information that's often needed to look at these alternative lending programs that are beneficial to them, that really can help them get the capital they need to succeed. You talk about CDFIs. I'm talking about the State Small Business Credit Initiative. How do you get information out to these small businesses so that they will know that there are these lending programs that are there to assist them?
Senator Thomas, thank you again for both that observation and question. And my answer is not intended to be flippant, so I'll apologize before I give it.
Good.
The way we get information out to businesses that need help, whether it is through answering questions like, how much should I raise prices to keep up with inflation? How do I get a loan if my credit score is too low? The answer to how you get information out is any way possible. Now, I personally, this won't surprise you, I personally believe that the chambers of commerce are doing a good role in that and we can always do better. I'm a little bit biased coming from the chamber world. But if you think about what chambers of commerce do, there is tremendous opportunity, not necessarily in the business community that provides the loans, but the business community that needs the loans for collaboration. Whether it is the National Association of Women Business Owners, whether it is the Minority and Black Chambers of Commerce, whether it is the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, those information networks where it's peer-to-peer learning are better trust networks than we could ever design on the World Wide Web. And getting information on State Small Business Credit Initiative, getting information on what is a community development financial institution, getting that into those networks of business owners is the most efficient, but also the most disparate way to get that information out. Senator Thomas, I actually will take your observation back with me, talk with our folks who run the small business digital platform, see what we can do to maybe pump up a little bit some of the articles and that we have on the platform that direct businesses who do a Google search. I mean, it's really as simple as that. We worked before releasing our small business digital platform. We worked for over 8 months building out search engine optimization so that if a small business owner asks, how do I access government grants? The articles we produce would come up in the top 3 searches. And I think we can do some work, and I'll talk with the editors of that group and say, hey, how can we up the SEO system to bump up questions about CDFIs? So I appreciate you bringing that up this afternoon.
Thank you. Let me quickly give a plug for my own Chamber of Commerce, Commerce Lexington, because we were the Chamber of the Year in 2016 here in America. So Commerce Lexington does an excellent job as a member of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Co-Chair King.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. May we go back to the slide and review Small Business Bill of Rights, please, while Charles is pulling that up. While he's pulling it up, are your thoughts that this is a federal ask, or you're asking Kentucky to address these 5 needs? And then I may go from there if that's okay.
Thank you, Senator King. So first of all, this was developed for my daily work with members of Congress in Washington, D.C. The reason I included it in this deck is, honestly, these are 5 points of view from the lenses of the small businesses that I work with. And they've asked that policy leaders look through this lens as much as possible. So it was intended to be directed to my colleagues in Washington, D.C., but the small businesses who helped us come up with this, they'd love for everyone to look through the lenses of policy through these five principles.
May I follow up? Thank you. Since 2016, the General Assembly in the Commonwealth has addressed most, if not all, of these. So I'm glad to see that you recognize that and you're kind of looking at it more of a federal lens. When I see Bill of Rights, the first thing that comes to my mind is at the expense of anything else. So is that your intention? Alleviate some of my concerns there.
Representative King, thank you again for that question. That was not my intention, is that this be elevated to the detriment of anything else. Really trying to bring what we hear from small businesses who have a luxury of taking some time and meeting with legislators, trying to bring their points of view to a daily understanding of how to approach policy was the intention, but it was not designed to prioritize above other valuable priorities.
That's good to hear. I'm glad we have that on the record. I certainly understand that some states in the United States do not the way that the good government has here in Kentucky. So you've alleviated my fears. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome. Co-Chair Pratt.
Thanks, sir. Mr. Sullivan, we talked a little bit earlier. We're going to circle back around. Basically, what you're talking about is the H-2B program. We're talking about the guest workers. And just to educate everybody on this committee, H-2B are guest workers. They can come for 10 months. They have to pass a background check. They have to they come here legally after 10 months. They have to return home. And they are the good guys that's coming across the border. What we're seeing right now, you and I talked about that, is the fact that this program is a political football in D.C. They cap it, they uncap it, then they cap it again, then uncap it. What can we do to straighten this program up? These are the guys that actually pay all the taxes, and if they have committed a crime in Mexico or in the United States, a misdemeanor, they cannot come across the border. Would you like to comment, sir?
So thank you for that question. Thank you for our conversation earlier. This is a perfect example of the need for certainty in order for small businesses to be successful and to grow. And as my boss likes to say, not careen from guardrail to guardrail, depending on what politician is in charge. The H-2B program, as you outlined, because of the changing caps and the lottery system that is just that. It's a lottery system. And it does not add to certainty when a small business owner has to gamble on whether or not they're going to have enough workers to meet what they would like to see as demand for increased revenues and growth in their business and growth in their community. So I appreciate you raising this, and this is absolutely a specific case of what we mean by building uncertainty. And the answer to your question about what we do with it, we work with our federal partners to impress upon them why the system needs greater certainty in order for small businesses to take advantage of the program.
Mr. Chair, I got a couple more if you don't mind.
Please.
And again, follow up with that. You have to run an ad in the local paper, also in Indeed. And if anyone shows up, agrees to work for that, the amount we're offering, which is, I think for us is $15.44 an hour starting pay with full benefits, you have to hire them. We have yet, and we've been at this for several years, we have not hired a soul. And that, then if you, like for us, we request 15. If someone says, yes, I work, that number goes to 14. But yes, so they're not taking away good paying jobs. You also mentioned about the, while the revenues are up, I think we need to take a good look at, you mentioned profits, and that's the cost of goods. At least in my business, I know they said the inflation rate's 8% or 7.8, whatever the number is. I did some quick math earlier in the week, and we are up 38% to 250% cost of goods. Needless to say, while our revenues are up, we can't charge that much to catch up with the inflation rate. And also with interest rate at 8%, if you're expanding your business, that eats your life also, which is a 20-year high. Would you like to comment about that?
I think my comment is just to agree with you. The inflationary challenges facing small businesses seem insurmountable, and everything we could do to try to bring inflation down has to be done. So other than thanking you for bringing a specific example this afternoon and agreeing with you, I don't have specific solutions.
Thanks, sir. And one more question. Actually, again, you talking about government overreach. There's two parts to this. One is a great example of my company is WOTUS, Waters of the U.S. If you dig up, and again, it's failed twice. Now the president's done it by executive order, I believe. If you dig a mud puddle in the back of your yard, they get the right to regulate it. They can tell you whether or not you can fill it in, not fill it in, which is great overreach by the federal government. It's extremely cumbersome. Now, again, it's great overreach. And you talked also about the business owners being unsure about the future or the economy. That's because most of us feel our economy is propped up on toothpicks, and we're afraid it's going to come down. And that's my last question, sir.
Thank you for pointing out the Waters of the U.S. debacle. Charles and I had an opportunity this morning to meet with a courageous small business owner. Colin Stout runs a company called Innovative Demolition. He blows up bridges as part of his business. And it was made very clear to Charles and me that this is not an easy business. And he was brave enough to be a declarant in the lawsuit challenging the Waters of the U.S. rule that we were proud to be a plaintiff on with Kentucky Associated Contractors and the Kentucky Chamber and others. But Colin was brave enough to tell his story in a legal document and risk upsetting federal regulators who have tremendous control on whether or not his bids to provide concrete cutting and demolition services will be accepted by the primes. And so I agree with you about the ridiculousness of that particular example, but I did want to just take a moment to commend you for this remarkable small business owner in Lexington who had the courage to speak out and help a successful lawsuit challenging the Waters of the U.S. rule.
Thank you, Representative Pratt. Representative Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, a point of clarification. Could you let me know how the Chamber defines small business?
We follow the federal definition, which at its most simple point is 500 or fewer employees. It gets a little bit more complicated depending on the industry.
Thank you for that. So I own a small business, and one of my biggest challenges, the vice president of my chamber is here, and she's heard me say this before. One of my biggest challenges is that so many small businesses can't actually access their chambers because the price points for a small business to enter the chamber can be really cumbersome. In my region, it's almost $400 for any business to join the chamber, even if that's a sole proprietor business. So I love that you say that you're moving more towards a small business focus and really skill sets and tools for small business owners. I would simply just ask if you would take that back with you and see what could be done at the chamber level to make it more accessible to more businesses. My actual question is, you mentioned the number of new business tax IDs that have been applied for, and that it's at I think you said it was the second highest it's been. I have a slight concern that some of those may not be people who are pursuing their dream of small business ownership, but perhaps having to do side hustles to make ends meet because of the cost of living right now. So as promising as that number may be, another number that's really concerning to me, or other numbers that are really concerning to me, are 23% increase in Chapter 13 filings at the halfway point of this year and 55% increase in Chapter 11 filings at the halfway point of this year. Can you talk about what the Chamber's concerns may be about closures of small businesses and what you all may be doing to help?
Thank you for that question. So first of all, on the side hustle thing, you're right about how tough it is out there, and that folks are working their tails off to make ends meet. I don't know if I've ever met a small business who doesn't have a side hustle too, and so the side hustle component kind of has two sides to that coin. Sometimes it's really a cool part of entrepreneurship, and you're right, sometimes it also is just struggling to make ends meet. As far as the Chapter 11 and Chapter 13 filings, I have seen those numbers pick up. That I'm going to pretend to be an economist. I'm not. Those tend to be lagging indicators. So you're seeing some failures that are likely to have been long in the making, not short in the making. And the vast majority of small businesses that quote unquote fail, and I'm saying quote unquote primarily because there's so many different definitions of failure, it gets really confusing. Most of them don't seek bankruptcy protection. And so we see it as an indicator, but not a high prioritized indicator. And I think the admission of small businesses failing is probably the toughest part of my job. And I would say that, building on Senator Thomas's comments before, helping establish these peer networks where folks don't feel like it's going it there by themselves produces amazing results. And I commend you for not only being a courageous small business owner, but also for being a member of the Chamber of Commerce. One thing I'm going to bring back to my team in Washington, D.C. is the complement to their small business digital platform. Because at the beginning of this journey, over 6 years ago, there was a question: do we make this digital platform exclusive to Chamber membership? Or should we be looking at this as a resource to bolster free enterprise in America and therefore make it accessible to anyone who can Google a term? And the choice was the latter. And I think there's probably still points where they question that decision. And I'll bring your comments back to them to say, look, every small business can't maybe afford to join a chamber, but they have access to this digital tool, and it's important. So I appreciate you raising that.
Last question before we get to Dr. All, Representative Grossberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's actually a two-part question. The first is, looking at this Small Business Bill of Rights, I have to ask, what is there unique that would not be on just a business Bill of Rights? Because looking at this looks like a list of interests that any corporation would want.
So I'm glad so thank you for that question. I guess personally, I'd say, well, it was designed directly from about 35 of my closest small business advisors. So that is unique, but it's not obviously built into the language. Perhaps I should introduce it maybe with a little bit more emphasis on who came up with it rather than some of the substance. But you're right. I think that there isn't necessarily a distinct small business that comes out of it. I think the reality, at least from how the small businesses have talked with me once we finalized it, the reality is that each of these becomes more personal to the CEO in a small business than it would in a larger organization, because they're basically, you've all heard this before, the CEO in a small business is the recruiter, the custodian, the tax preparer, kind of the lawyer, all of these things. And so a difference isn't necessarily in the language, but it's how connected that language is with the day-to-day operations of the person who's in charge of the enterprise.
Thank you. And my follow-up question is more of actually a suggestion. Like many people on this committee, I also have a small business. And what I would encourage be added to the list is the right to participate in the market without an improper competitive advantage that big businesses have. Because as Senator Thomas pointed out, access to capital is a big one, but it's not the only one. We have a lot of policies, federal policies and state policies, that create a disadvantage to small business, which is the lifeblood of the economy without a doubt. And it's everything from corporate welfare to the tax structure to exemptions on all kinds of policies. And I would just ask that this 35-person committee, which came up with a great list, include that as part of the lens of making sure that whatever policies we enact here in Kentucky and whatever's enacted in Washington doesn't create an unfair advantage for the 500-person plus businesses over the 500 and under businesses, which typically is 1 to 5. Maybe it's 1 to 10, but I think 1 to 5 is probably the honest majority. So thank you for indulging me, and thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Would it be okay if I comment on the comment? Is that so? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So first of all, on the data side, your instinct is correct. I mean, 83% of businesses in this wonderful country don't have employees, which is something sometimes we skip over. So you're right. The vast majority of small businesses are tiny. It's not a technical term, but they're tiny small businesses. As far as your question about wanting to be helpful and then having unintended consequences of helping large versus small, or quite frankly, small versus large, I do want to comment that really this is one of the reasons I love working at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And I can't speak on behalf of my colleagues in the Kentucky Chamber, but this idea that we can convene large and small businesses and work through very difficult issues that you all are working through is really a remarkable opportunity for our business association. And we do it every day. And we don't put votes before this group and say, okay, are we going to look at minimum wage at $16.50? Big business vote here, small business vote there. No, we don't do that, but we do bring large and small businesses together and talk about the appropriateness or the inappropriateness of federal minimum wage writ large. And we are better off for that convening power of smalls and larges together. And I think we're better off for that convening compared to if we only convened a particular size business and came up with a set of solutions. So I do appreciate your comment on being wary of having unintended consequences of different policy decisions. So thank you for that.
Thank you, members, for those questions, and Mr. Sullivan for the answers. I had a chairman fail earlier. I did not approve the minutes from last month. I'm going to do that really starts. Motion made. Second. All those in favor of approving the minutes, do so by saying aye. Aye. So motion carries. Thank you all. Dr. All.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know we're running a little short on time, so I'm going to move like the wind as I go through this presentation. The intention here is to make you aware of another resource to help understand how businesses, how small businesses, particularly in Kentucky, are viewing things like the economy, public policy, and government. I hope you will view this as a complement to resources that the U.S. Chamber has made available, such as the Small Business Index, because ultimately you all, I know there's always a need for more information, and that's the intent here, is simply to provide this as a resource. So I wanted to make sure you are aware of it. Over this past summer, the Kentucky Chamber partnered with the National Association of State Chambers of Commerce and the Siena College Research Institute to do some surveying of businesses here in Kentucky. And for those of you that aren't familiar, Siena College, they're most well known for a lot of their public political polling. So they've done some good work, particularly the U.S. House, for example. They're a well-regarded pollster, but they also do a lot of good work with business surveying as well. So we partnered with the Siena College Research Institute. We worked with local chambers of commerce. We worked with our members to cast as wide of a net as we could, and we conducted this survey throughout July and August of 2023, and we got a good response. About 300 different Kentucky CEOs and business leaders representing both for-profit and nonprofit entities responded to this survey, gave us their thoughts on a lot of different questions. About 65% of these respondents were small businesses, 31% were medium-sized, and 4% were large firms. I know we'll get that question about what's a small firm. In the context of this survey, it was less than 100 employees. So that was the working definition. I do want to be crystal clear here. This is not a scientifically determined representative sample. That's very, very difficult to do in the context of business. But what you do have ultimately are the views of about 300 CEOs and business leaders from all around the state. And I can tell you, as someone that's worked in business advocacy for about 7 to 8 years now, it's pretty hard to get businesses to respond to surveys. They're really busy. So the fact that we can get 300 to give us their thoughts on the economy, business decisions, and public policy and government, I think that's a good thing. And I wanted to share some of the results of that survey for you all. First, just concerning the economy, I think a lot of this jives really well with what Tom was talking about. You see some general optimism. 37% responded that they expect the economy to be better a year from now. 32% said about the same. 31% expect it to be worse. Notably, about 58% are planning to invest in fixed assets in the state. So that's going to be things like machinery, building. That's a good positive sign. Another positive sign from this concerning the economy is that of these 300 employers, only about 5% anticipate decreasing the size of their workforce. And when you think about the threat of layoffs, for example, not a huge concern amongst these employers that we surveyed. 40% are actually expecting to increase the size of their workforce. So good positive info there. In terms of challenges, we got a good set. Siena asked them, listed out a whole range of different things that might come up as different types of challenges. Adverse economic conditions generally were the top issue that we heard from Kentucky employers, but also things like regulations, higher healthcare costs, rising supplier cost, energy cost, and of course, taxes all made that list as well. So a good spread of different issues. Workforce was something that the survey really honed in on, and we heard a lot of challenges amongst these 300 employers when it comes to workforce. About 80% saying that there is not an ample supply of workers in their local area, and in particular, skilled and semi-skilled workers turned out to be the most difficult to come across. Something that we often hear when we talk about employer workforce challenges is, well, just increase wages and you won't have that problem anymore. What we came up with in this survey is about 79% have done that. 62% have done that also to increase their starting wages. So we're seeing a lot of employers, and this coalesces, or this goes really well with a lot of other data we've seen in terms of employers increasing wages. I think a really interesting set of questioning that Siena College went into with this survey was asking employers their thoughts on if they anticipate still being in the state over the next 10 years. And about 79% came back, said, felt pretty confident that they would absolutely be in the state. Only about 6% said no. We also asked these employers if they could do it all over again, if they could start their businesses again, would they still start it in Kentucky? About 77% came back affirmatively. What's interesting, though, is amongst some of these folks who said they would maybe do it in a different state, the survey followed up and asked them, well, what states would you might prefer? And it's an interesting spread. We see Florida and Tennessee at the top. Often we hear about those two states, but then Indiana and California coming in below those. But interesting responses from folks who said they would do it over again in a different place with these particular states being highlighted. We asked them what they thought state policymakers in particular should be most focused on. Pretty resounding response. With an emphasis on workforce. And you all have done great work in this area. I think a good way to interpret this is to understand the need for just continued pressure on the issue of workforce development. Similarly, you see a lot of interest in things like personal income tax reform, business income tax reform, Two other areas where I think this General Assembly has shown a lot of great leadership. Again, continued pressure in those areas, I think, is what you're hearing from employers who are responding to this survey. Finally, before I wrap things up here, we also just asked Kentucky employers how they view government. Generally speaking, when you ask anybody how they view government, it's hard to get a particularly positive reaction. However, when it comes to Kentucky state government as a whole, employers felt that 51% of our state government is doing an excellent or good job in creating a strong business climate. 55% are very confident or somewhat confident in the ability of state government to improve Kentucky's business climate over the next year. And what I would encourage you to do is to juxtapose that with how they view the federal government. And it's a very, very different picture. 19% responded that they said the federal government is doing an excellent job or good job in creating a strong business climate, while just 25% are very confident or somewhat confident in the ability of the federal government to improve the business climate over the next year. What I hope you all would take from that is to understand some of the pressure that employers in Kentucky and the attention that they're really giving to state policymakers. That is where their confidence lies in the future of the economy of the state. Very much in your all's hands. And so I hope you'll take that into consideration. If you want to learn more about this, we've written extensively about this survey. You can go to kychamberbottomline.com. We've also written about the business application data that Tom mentioned. If you want to see how that looks like on a county by county basis, you can find that there. And of course, I want to mention Kentucky's Winning Strategy, which is a document we produced earlier this year, hitting on a lot of these topics that outlines an economic vision for the state. With that, Chairman, I'm happy to wrap up and take any questions.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much for the information and for the detailed survey results. We do have a question, Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Charles, looking at the slide, top challenges facing Kentucky employers, you laid out 12 different items there, and it looks like the top 4 are all government related. So is it safe to say that government is the #1 problem of small business owners?
You know, and in a lot of ways, government can do a lot to create barriers for employers. I think good government, though, can also be out there and creating opportunities. But absolutely, there are levers that government can be pulling that can hurt small businesses and that can also help small businesses. And I think as policymakers, that's going to be something that needs to be deeply considered in the policymaking process, is that actions, legislative actions, these things have positive and negative consequences.
Absolutely. May I follow up,
Yeah,
please?
please do.
So, it would be interesting, and I saw in a later slide there some of the issues that they were talked about specifically, but trying to identify some of the exact challenges within these areas, I think would be interesting for us to survey and consider as we move forward.
I agree, Representative Baker, and I think one of the key ways to get through that is, this paints a very, very broad, with a very broad brush. Conversations like the one Tom mentioned earlier today that we are having with Mr. Stout in his business, I think that's how you get to that nuance. You got to have those constant conversations, and that's something why at the Kentucky Chamber, for example, we have a small business council. So that gives us an opportunity to really sit down with these folks and pick their brains, so that when we look at data like this and you see something like regulations, well, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. And we can really dive into it. And so really that's where I think you find that nuance.
Exactly. I look forward to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Representative Stalker.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm over here to your right in the middle section. Question for you. So what I heard you say at the beginning of your presentation was that when you surveyed individuals, these 300s, I heard you say that some of that comprised of nonprofits. I didn't see it written in the slide, but I heard you say nonprofits, correct?
That is correct.
Do you have an idea what percentage of those 300, how many of those were nonprofits?
About 30%.
30%. And I'm assuming, do they also fall in that range of the small, the medium, or the large, or do they particularly fall more to larger nonprofits?
They're folded into those larger numbers. Generally speaking, a lot of nonprofits do tend to fall into that smaller category, but I would imagine you have some that could surpass 100. Absolutely.
Sure. So that kind of leads me to my next question, is on one of the other slides where you talked about workforce challenges in Kentucky. You'd noted that in your survey that 79% of employers have increased wages to retain workers. And I know it is hard for people to want to participate in surveys, particularly long ones, but I'm curious if what data or information did you potentially dig down in regarding this question? Do we have any idea of what people's base wages were to begin with? Because if they're low to begin with and they've simply increased it and are still not seeing the response that they want, that I don't think that that's surprising. And I specifically wanted to know about the nonprofits because as somebody whose background is in the nonprofit sector, what we consistently hear in that sector is that folks do not want to pay for people to work at these organizations. They want 100% of every dollar that they donate to go to fill in the blank cause. And so I think that presents a very difficult challenge to the nonprofit sector specifically. So
I think you raise both a great question and a great observation in regards to how nonprofits are able to compete in this space where we are seeing a lot of rising wages. For the very reason you just mentioned, oftentimes CEOs of nonprofits are having to be very responsive to their donors. And I've heard that same concern brought up where they don't necessarily want this going into higher wages, higher benefit packages. They want it to accomplish the actual work. That is going to be a difficulty that nonprofits are facing. We see this in other sectors too. Childcare, great example of this, where childcare providers are simply boxed in a lot of ways when it comes to rising prices and rising wages. It makes it very, very difficult to compete. Go back to your first question. Again, with lengthy surveys, we're not able to get quite to that granularity. I would be able to pull out maybe specifically how I think I can do that, how nonprofits maybe responded to that question, and I could follow back up with you and see if we can kind of pinpoint exactly how nonprofits responded to that question.
I would be interested in all of the respondents, particularly because I think it begs the question, what are you starting at? And it's great if you've increased it, but if it wasn't enough to begin with, it just may not be giving us, obviously, the results that we want. Thank you so much.
Representative Grossberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How does the Chamber reconcile the small business right to be free from government interference with Kentucky's shift from a broad-based income tax to higher service charges and sales taxes, which disproportionately impact small businesses?
Ultimately, when it comes to pursuing individual income tax cuts, that is arguably one of the things we hear the most from small businesses. So we're responding directly to issues that they are raising themselves. I do think, though, when it comes to expanding our sales tax base, this is something we need to be extremely sensitive to. If you're a very, very large firm and we expand the sales tax base to include services that are particularly purchased by small businesses, that can create a lot of issues that will be faced particularly by smaller firms that might not have those types of in-house services. So our view on this is that we absolutely need to continue reducing individual income taxes, keeping in mind a lot of small business owners are going to be paying their taxes through the individual income tax code. So when we talk about reducing individual income taxes, that is directly positively impactful for small business owners, many of whom pay those taxes as pass-through entities. When it comes to expanding our sales tax base, expanding that to certain types of services, that's something that we're seeing happen across the country. What we want to make sure that when that is done is that's done in a way to where that tax is not falling on small businesses. And so I think this legislature is walking that line and trying to figure that process out as we go through the process of making potential expansions to our sales tax base to ensure that business purchases, especially when it comes to services, as we expand that to services, that is taken into account for.
Senator Mills, last question.
Charles, I'm over here. I find this odd. Well, first question is on when you talked about the poll or the survey, it said small, 65% were from small. What do you consider small?
Yeah, that's in the context of this survey. Yeah. It's going to be less than 100.
Less than 100. Okay.
Yeah, less than 100 head count.
I still feel like something's missed there. And when she asked the question about nonprofits making up 30% of the survey, I still think there's a lot more pessimism out there amongst small businesses mainly the majority of those small businesses in Kentucky, aren't they about 25 or less when you really consider the majority of small businesses? I think there's still pessimism out there amongst, and it's really about uncertainty, what y'all were talking about in Kentucky. So I think this is missing it just a little bit, and it may be because more 100 or 90 or 100 people submitted, and those folks may have been more successful at getting PPP and loans that have helped them through the pandemic. But the small business, the service providers, restaurants, and everything else, those are the folks that are really struggling in our economy right now, and there's more pessimism there. But I appreciate the survey, but I don't think that I don't think this survey exactly summarizes all of small business.
Absolutely, Senator Mills. And it's one of those things where I think it's important, anybody viewing the survey, you kind of got to take it for what it is, right? There's limitations on any type of survey. To your broader point, though, about pessimism, a lot of what I see, and I think Tom might share this, is two other words come to mind. One is nervousness, and that kind of goes back to the uncertainty that you talked about. I pick up on a lot of nervousness when I talk to smaller employers. Uncertainty about what's going to happen, where are things going. There's a lot of that. The other thing we see is just fatigue. Some of these small business owners, they are worn out. Going back to the conversation Tom and I were having this morning, we have such short memories sometimes, but COVID, absolutely exhausting. And then we have foreign conflicts, inflation, workforce shortages. These things, they don't stop. And if all you're trying to do is make payroll, it is exhausting. And so that to me is almost scarier in some sense, because how long can some of these folks keep going?
I agree with that. It's kind of follow up the fatigue issue. So many small businesses owners are actually working the jobs that they filling in for 3, 4, 5 people. Our best restaurant in Henderson, the owner is there every night, waiting on tables, picking things up because he's 3 or 4 short. And at some point, if we don't solve this workforce issue, those guys are just going to throw the towel in and be done and walk away. So still a lot of, even though you paint a little bit of a rosy picture, still a lot of challenges left for small businesses,
yes,
obviously. Sir. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Mills. Gentlemen, thank you for the presentation today. Thank you for all the information you provided. Mr. Sullivan, thank you for making the trip to the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and give your best to your wife, as a native Kentuckian also. The second on our agenda today, and our last, will be the threat of cyber attacks on our nation's critical infrastructure. I would ask Mr. Dave Hatter with Entrust IT, cybersecurity consultant, if he would make his way to the table for his presentation today. Mr. Hatter, thank you for your patience as we get through our first presentation there. And as protocol, if you would just identify yourself for the record, please, and the floor is yours. There's a microphone. If you push the...
Yep, sorry. We actually have these at our city building. You think I would know how to operate this. My name is Dave Hatter. I'm the Director of Business Growth with Entrust IT. I'm also the Mayor of Fort Wright, Kentucky. So as a native Kentuckian, I appreciate you all having me down today. This is a topic I'm extremely passionate about. But I also just wanted to take a second and say I think it's great you had the Chamber of Commerce in. That was all very interesting to me. I'm a former small business owner myself. And I just, from my perspective, both as the mayor and as a former small business owner, I appreciate what you guys do every day. And I think you are definitely taking Kentucky in the right direction. So on that front, keep up the good work. So I'm not going to read all this stuff to you. I've been in the IT business for a long time, have a degree from NKU, 30 plus years I've been doing this. And one of the reasons why I transitioned out of a pure software development role into more of a cybersecurity role is because I continued to see the same sort of problems come up over and over again. And I guess I really have 3 points I'd like to make to you all today. First off, we are an increasingly software-driven world. Everything is digital. More on that in a second. Secondarily, almost all of the technology that makes all of our daily lives work was developed 40 to 50 years ago. And it's just sort of inherently insecure by design. If you go back and look at the original underpinnings of the internet when it was created, no one could envision how it's used today. And think about it for a second. Who here does not have a smartphone? I don't see any hands going up. Who here does not shop online? Who here does not bank online? Who here does not do healthcare online, right? Everything is digital. And again, the technology that makes all of this stuff work, both from a consumer perspective as well as a business perspective, and more importantly, again, sort of the crux of my point today is our critical infrastructure all relies on technology that's kind of inherently insecure out of the gate. So, and then my final point is I have some suggestions and some asks of you as the legislature for things I think we can do that would hopefully make the situation a whole lot better. Mark Andreessen, if you're not familiar, he's the guy that created the first web browser. So you can thank him for the fix that we're in today to some extent. He's also a famous investor and pretty well known in the technology industry. He said this to Wall Street Journal many years ago, and it's absolutely true. Everything has software in it today. Your phone, your refrigerator, your coffee maker, your car, right? Your car is essentially a computer on wheels. And on a sort of a side note, if you haven't seen it, Mozilla, they make a web browser called Firefox, puts out a study every year. In fact, they got a great website called Privacy Not Included. And it digs deep into all of the stuff out there that is essentially not very privacy friendly. And they recently just took a look at cars from 25 manufacturers. If you haven't seen that, you might want to spend a few seconds and take a look at it. You might be shocked at what your new car is collecting about you. But my point is everything has software in it. Another thing to keep in mind, because again, I'm going to mostly focus on critical infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, that kind of thing. But how many of you here have a smart TV? Probably everyone, right? Because it's hard to buy a TV that isn't, quote, smart anymore, or anything else for that matter. A recent study showed that of the major smart TV manufacturers, folks like LG and Samsung and Philips, if you take a look at what they're doing, most of them won't put out software updates for their smart TV for more than about 2 years. So if you have a smart TV that's more than 2 years old, it's basically a ticking privacy and security time bomb because there will be flaws in that software and they're not going to be fixed. And that's part of my concern here. So again, part of the concern is you have software and everything now, much of which is rushed to market where security and privacy are an afterthought at best. Again, I'm more concerned about the security in this conversation. And so much of this stuff moves so quickly. The businesses that are using this, the critical infrastructure that relies on this now, don't really understand the consequences of making sure they're addressing updates and such. Again, trying to make the point about our increasingly digital world. This chart comes out every year, and it shows you, now obviously this is all estimated, right? But in a given minute, what's happening on the internet every day. And if you look at this over time, it's pretty astounding. I'm obviously not going to read all this to you, but for example, 16.2 million texts sent. I'm sure there have been some texts sent while we're all sitting here, right? I mean, you can't avoid this stuff. Unless you want to totally get off the grid and have a sort of a Luddite type life, there's no way you can avoid technology. It's in everything now, right? And then you have the Internet of Things. Now, I'm going to focus mostly on the industrial Internet of Things and some terminology here in a minute, but you're smart, again, smart TV, smart coffee maker, smart refrigerator, smart washing machine. All of this stuff has software in it. Most of it is rushed to market. A lot of it comes from China. And it's sort of inherently insecure out of the box. People don't know how to configure it correctly. They don't understand how to update it. And consequently, every time you plug one of these things in somewhere, whether it's a smart refrigerator or it's some sort of sensor in your factory, there are potential security implications these things create. As you can see, according to this infographic, there's an estimate that there'll be 76 billion, and I'm going to use this term loosely, smart devices online by 2025. Each one of those a potential security concern. So I won't read this definition to you, but again, my point is to start out, we're in this now digital economy, right? Everything is digital. Everything is driven by software. And like I said, I spent about 25 years as a software engineer. I was one of those nerdy people that sat at a desk creating code all day long. I can tell you from firsthand experience, I am personally responsible for hundreds, if not thousands of bugs in the probably millions of lines of code I created over the last 25 years. Now, I didn't intentionally create any of those bugs, right? I'm just a human being like everyone else. I make mistakes. The software wasn't tested thoroughly, etc. So that's part of this problem. In fact, I would encourage you all to take a look, and I've got some links at the end of this deck. There's a great article from The Atlantic a few years ago called The Coming Software Apocalypse. And they're pointing out, and they're not even going down like a cyber attack route, okay? They're pointing out because we are increasingly reliant on software that's increasingly built by human beings and increasingly complex and interrelated, right? This system talks to that system, talks to some third-party system. There's all this risk that's aggregating through all of this software, right? And software failures are increasingly Boeing 737 MAX. If you haven't followed that story at all, you'll recall a couple of those crashed, and it was software related. So again, my point I'm going to get to here is all of this software that we're increasingly relying on now has an impact in the physical world. 20 years ago, maybe your hard disk crash, you lose your family photos. That's unfortunate. Or you get ransomware and you lose your family photos. Now we're in a situation where if you're in a fully automated car, for example, and I can assure you all, you will not see me riding in any fully autonomous cars anytime soon. Okay? Not going to happen anytime soon. And I would encourage you to take the same approach. But like if you take a look out in San Francisco, where they have a lot of these cars, folks will literally run up and stick a cone on the hood of the car, and the car just freaks out. It doesn't know what to do. Okay? Again, I'm not against technology by any stretch of the imagination, but we're sort of getting into a wild west of this digital first economy. Everything is software driven. I probably don't need to make the point too hard on this, but if this is a wide and broad spectrum of different news stories from different types of media outlets, right? Some of these are technology, some are business oriented, but as you can see, and these are all more consumer oriented things, every day, and in the business that we're in, we deal with this every day. I could sit here for the rest of the afternoon and tell you firsthand stories of businesses that are losing tens of thousands to millions of dollars through cyber attacks. But again, that's not really the thrust of what I want to cover today. There are a couple things here, though. For example, that PC Magazine article. Hacker deepfakes employee's voice in phone call to breach IT company. Right? AI is fueling some of these attacks, also increasing the risk of these sorts of large-scale cyber attacks. These four articles here really kind of get to the crux of what I want to talk about today. You can see there from Reuters, Americans should prepare for cyber sabotage from Chinese hackers, and this is several months old. Right? I think the risk of this continues to escalate as there's more chaos around the world. Nevada School District refuses to submit to ransomware blackmail. Hacker publishes student data. My point of showing you that is you are dealing with people who will literally stoop to know. They don't know any lower level to what they will do to get your money. And these are just the folks that are after your money, not the nation state folks who are potentially going to derail a train somewhere or something. Schneider power meter vulnerability opens the door to power outages. And then first death reported following a ransomware attack in a hospital in Germany. And the connection I'm trying to make here is our physical world increasingly relies on software, much of which is vulnerable. Then you've got CISA, DHS. CISA, if you don't know, is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, FBI, all kinds of different government agencies who have ramped up the warnings about this stuff. Again, this was several months ago, this particular article, long before the continuing chaos that we're seeing in the world, unfortunately. This is some data actually from the FBI. The FBI has a website called the Internet Crime Complaint Center. I would encourage you all to check it out, ic3.gov. It's not only full of useful tips, but it's also full of a lot of statistics. I've seen a senior FBI agent say that they believe only about 10 to 12% of all cybercrime is reported. These are stats directly from the FBI there. Now, obviously, the stuff from 2023 on is a projection, but if you look through 2022, without getting too deep into the numbers, the point of showing you this is there's an increasing amount of cybercrime, cyber attacks, however you want to think about it, and that's going up for several reasons. One of which is the bad guys are rarely caught, and the second is they are making enormous amounts of money. And this is kind of where we're at now, right? Our whole society depends on this. Your keyboard is essentially a grenade. One wrong move for you as an individual, one wrong move for you as an organization, or more importantly, in infrastructure. And again, when I put my mayor's hat on, in Northern Kentucky, we're fortunate that we have agencies like the Water District, right? We don't have our own water plant. We don't have our own sewage plant. We don't have to deal with some of this stuff. And I've talked to these agencies extensively. They take these kind of things seriously, but I know in other parts of Kentucky, small city might be running its own water plant. Do they have the resources to take these sorts of things into consideration? My guess is probably no. One of the reasons why local governments are frequently attacked, you saw that story there about Dallas, New Orleans has lost a lot of money, Fort Lauderdale's lost a lot of money, is because they don't have the knowledge and the skills and the resources to address these things correctly. This guy here is a guy named Mikko Hipponen. He's an international cybersecurity expert, someone I follow because he's pretty wise. And I love this quote because this really is where we are in society. And it's so important for everyone to start to take this stuff seriously, not only because, it might have significant consequences on you as an individual or as a business, But because of the interconnection, and I'm going to give you some concrete examples, and you'll see what I mean here, a third-party risk from your business might bring down some other business or some sort of public infrastructure. So we really need to be thinking about this from this perspective. As I mentioned before, you've got a lot of different reasons why this is occurring. Partially because everything is digital, so there's more opportunities. Partially because so much of this stuff is coming from offshore and countries that at best turn a blind eye or at worst are complicit in it. Some of you may have seen the recent stories that apparently North Korea has been hiring people to come work in the U.S. and send the money back to North Korea to fund their government. This just broke within the past few weeks. So I know some of this stuff sounds really far-fetched and kind of crazy, but I mean, that's where we're at. So you've got different level actors, including the state-sponsored actors. The primary thing I'm concerned with today, what you will often hear is sort of the axis of evil in the cybersecurity world, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. They have essentially unlimited time, unlimited resources to come after you if they want to. And unfortunately, they are and have, and there's, again, some evidence of that I'll show you. And then, like I said before, for the folks that aren't in a nation-state type situation, they aren't some sort of military hackers working for the Chinese Communist Party or something, you've got ransomware gangs and other types of criminal gangs out there making enormous amounts of money. The FBI recently reported that they believe business email compromise, which is a common scam we see every day in our field, generated $46 billion in fraud over the past 5 years. Now think about that for a second. $46 billion. What's the budget of the state of Kentucky? I probably should know this offhand. I don't know. Is it $46 billion? So, I mean, it's like a whole state, right, economy that the bad guys are raking in dough. So I want to kind of transition to my next phase here. I won't read this whole definition to you, but I think it does a good job of sort of summarizing security, right? The idea that we want to protect our assets. And as we rely more and more on critical infrastructure that is now driven by software, it's never been more important. When you talk to nerds like me, you'll hear this sort of terminology. So I wanted to lay these things out. Operational technology, right? Everyone knows what IT is, information technology is at this point. But when you talk about critical infrastructure like sensors and machinery in a factory, you'll often hear the term operational technology, right? It's not a regular computer, but it might have a CNC controller on it or some type of sensors that's collecting data, right? Industrial control system. Most modern factories have an extensive amount of industrial control systems that they're using to manage the factory, right? Run the machines, collect data, improve operational efficiencies, that sort of thing. Another older term, but similar kind of thing, supervisory control and data acquisition, or SCADA. So if you see ICS, SCADA, Industrial Internet of Things, these terms, that's what they're talking about, right? And that's what I'm going to focus on from here on out. So this is a slide deck where I stole some slides from CISA, again, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And it was specifically on why industrial control system security, or sort of this critical infrastructure security, is important, right? They say control systems are integral to critical infrastructure operations, functionality, and safety. Almost all critical infrastructure operations depend on ICS, right? All these plants, water plants, sewage plants, transportation, electrical grid, it all runs off these systems now. And going back to that article from The Atlantic for a second, one of the points they make in there is, as you have more software, and more software that talks to other software, in the old days, you could walk into like an electrical plant and things were controlled mechanically. If you flip this switch, you could physically see what happens, right? Well, now it's all software driven. Millions of lines of code. Did every one of those lines of code get tested? I'm going to roll out some changes. Again, if you've ever worked in the field, or is there anyone here who hasn't had a bad software upgrade in their life at some point? So you updated your Windows computer or your Apple phone or whatever, and it didn't go well, right? Believe it or not, the stuff doesn't always work right, So when you think about the fact that it's controlling, does the water come out of your tap, or does the electricity come out of your socket, or is there a train full of chlorine gas that's going to get derailed passing through your community? That's where we're at with this stuff. There was several years ago, Wired did a really interesting story where some hackers worked with a reporter and they took a Jeep Grand Cherokee out. And they were able to remotely access the Jeep Grand Cherokee while it was being driven and do all kinds of things to it, like control the brakes. Now, that led to a very large recall of the Grand Cherokee. But my point is, your car is essentially a computer. Could your car be hacked? Yes. Could your car be suddenly told, just accelerate until you can't accelerate anymore because you've just plowed into the semi in front of you? Or vice versa, you're driving along at 80 miles an hour in rush hour traffic and suddenly your brakes just slam on, right? That's where we're at with all of this stuff, okay? Again, from that same CISA slide deck, they talk about some of the challenges with industrial control systems. And I'll go back to the point I started out with, their first point there, legacy ICS, OT, aging and difficult to secure. So much of the stuff, the underlying technology that makes all of this work was developed decades ago, and when there was little to no concern about security and the fact that nation-state actors in another country could potentially take over control of these devices and do all kinds of crazy stuff. When you get down into security, really there's sort of three aspects, and I'm going to focus on the software piece, right? Where is the human piece? That's a big part of all of these problems, getting people to take this seriously and do the right sort of thing. Again, I'm going to kind of focus on software, and also you just can't have a security presentation without the confidentiality, integrity, and availability triads. I just had to throw that in there for good measure. So what this is showing you here, again, getting back to my point about software, what this is showing you is over time, there are more software vulnerabilities being determined or being discovered. And somehow I screwed this deck up. This slide should have been first. What this is showing you is there are more vulnerabilities being discovered. Well, that's partially because there's more software than ever before. Again, everything is software now, right? Everything is software defined. And there are also more people looking for these bugs. Thankfully, there are people like Google's Project Zero or Palo Alto Unit 42. These are teams of people that are getting paid to find vulnerabilities in software, report them to the manufacturer, and ideally get them fixed, okay? The problem, though, is there's not only more vulnerabilities, which, of course, again, more software, more people looking, they're more severe. Some of you may have heard of things like Pegasus, right, which is a type of malware that you can install on a phone, zero-click. I could potentially put Pegasus on your Apple phone. You don't have to do anything. I just send you a specially crafted message, and I can turn on your microphone. I can turn on your camera. I can access anything I want from your phone. I mean, this is a real thing right now, okay? So you have more secure vulnerabilities. And when you get back to this whole idea of software, so OWASP is an organization that deals with trying to help developers build secure software. And this chart you're looking at here, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, is really what made me get out of software and into security. So since 2003, this organization has been putting out guidance to help developers build better software. And several of the things there have been on the list for more than 20 years. It's the same sorts of problems over and over again, right? They're not getting addressed, SQL injection, things like that. And then that kind of gets us back to all of these so-called smart devices, industrial control systems. Now, this cartoon is kind of funny, but it really does a great job of summarizing where we're at with so much of this technology. So in theory, this is in your kitchen, and these are all your smart devices that you just had to have so you can know when your coffee's ready or that you need to get a new jar of mayonnaise or whatever. And if you take a look at these things here, there's your Nest thermostat. I'm turning off the heat until you warm up my bank account. And by the way, there's a search engine called Shodan specifically designed to find these sorts of smart devices plugged into your environment, right? You can go to Shodan and search for Nest thermostat or Mr. Coffee or whatever you want to look for. A couple of these others here. So you can see here, there's your Roomba vacuum sweeper over there. Wire my hacker $100 or I'll reverse my motor and blow dirt all over the place. Now, that would be unfortunate, right? But think about this for a second. Check out the smoke detector. $30 in Bitcoin, and the next time I smell smoke, I might just let you sleep. I mean, that's where we're at with this stuff, okay? A few last stories on this before I kind of get to the critical infrastructure piece. There's a story from the Washington Post where hackers were able to attack the sensors in the fish tanks of a casino. They stole over $5 million. And then, just to be clear, and I think this is kind of funny, but nicely summarizes my position on all these so-called smart devices. Tech enthusiasts, my entire house is smart. Tech workers, the only piece of technology in my house is a printer, and I keep a gun next to it to shoot it if it makes a noise I don't recognize. So, to kind of getting out of the crux of this critical infrastructure thing. So these are fairly recent real-world stories, and I'm always surprised how few people seem to know about the first one there. Hacker tried to poison Florida City's water supply. There's a water plant in Oldsmar, Florida. You can look this up for yourself. Hackers were able to break into this place. A lot of shoddy security practices, a lot of legacy equipment that needed to be updated and wasn't. They were able to get in there and change the amount of chemicals going into the water supply. Now, thankfully, this was caught very quickly and there wasn't any damage done to the public. But, I mean, these attacks have happened in the United States. If you look up the next story there, not Petya, one of the most damaging attacks. This was one of the first Russian deals with Ukraine back in 2015. They launched an attack on Russia through some ransomware that kind of broke out and did billions of dollars of damage around the world. Maersk, the big shipping company, cost them over $100 million to recover from this attack that wasn't even designed to hit them. And that speaks to the nature of all of these interconnected systems. Cyber attacks targeting Israel rising after Hamas assault. I'm sure that's no surprise to anyone. And Russia and Ukraine are going back and forth at this all the time. And then this last one here. If you're not familiar with this, if you really want to understand how devastating one of these attacks could be, Stuxnet was a virus the United States, well, no one has ever admitted to this, but you may recall back in the late 2000s, the Iranians were working on their nuclear program and using this Stuxnet virus that was originally discovered in their factories where they had these centrifuges trying to refine uranium. Basically, this virus would tell the operator that the centrifuges were operating within their tolerances while they were basically blowing themselves apart. So somehow that got in there, and somehow it fooled the operators. Hundreds of centrifuges were ruined as a result of that. So again, we're talking about physical damage in the real world as a result of software, whether it just goes bad or because, cyber attacks. Here's a very recent story. U.S. warning, hackers have built tools to attack key industrial control systems. And the list goes on. And then the last part I want to sort of focus on here is third-party risk. So even if you're an organization, your water plant in your local community, or whatever, is doing everything they're supposed to do, there is enormous risk through third parties now, right? You get into the idea of software supply chain and vendors. If you're not familiar with the Target attack that happened a few years ago, right? Target had a huge breach. Probably some of you got the notification that your data was stolen from Target. That actually happened through an HVAC contractor doing work at Target. The breach was not a result of bad practices at Target per se. The attackers attacked an HVAC contractor who was doing work for Target. Once the HVAC contractor connected their systems into Target systems to do their thing, the bad guys were able to get in. So this whole idea of third-party risk, and if you also may or may not be familiar, the SEC has come out with some new rules. Maybe some of you have seen the debacle at Clorox. Clorox was recently hit with a very devastating cyber attack, and they're now claiming it's going to impact their Q3 numbers. They're actually have lost money because of this cyber attack. So again, these things can be absolutely devastating. The SEC now has a rule where you have to report these things, which I think is long overdue personally. But in that new SEC rule, they talk about third-party risk. In fact, they refer to it 39 times. The other part of third-party risk that's critical is this whole idea of open source software. Open source software basically means I write some software and I'm just going to share it with you and you can use it however you want. That's kind of the layman's terms. It's a little more complex than that. But unfortunately, through the proliferation of this sort of open source software, at some point someone will say, hey, I wrote this software, feel free to use it, but I don't really want to maintain it anymore. Well, now you've used it. When there's a problem with it, who's going to fix that? Do you even know there's a problem with it, right? So what this particular slide is trying to address is a recent study looked at 1,700 plus different instances of software and found basically it's riddled with all kinds of problems. This software has a dependency on that software, which has a dependency on some other software. No one's updating it. It's a huge problem, okay? So what can you do about all this stuff other than just get off the grid, go like Ted Kaczynski, and never come out of your house again, which is not what I'm here to propose, by the way, okay? There are several things that can be done. And what I'm going to ask you all for is to work on education, which educating the public, educating businesses, educating these critical infrastructure agencies to take this seriously, some basic understanding of best practices, and there's some overlap with these four things. Some incentives that I think we should look at as a state, and then also some regulation, right? And I think there's some balance between all of these things that could have a huge impact, at least in Kentucky, and hopefully perhaps then carry over to some other states. So, like I said before, thankfully, the federal government, I think, has really started to ramp up the warnings about this and try to educate people. For example, the second thing there, they've now come out with something similar to Energy Star for Internet of Things devices. Like I said, in my opinion, the Internet of Things is like a cancer. If you have a Roomba, the best thing you could do would be to take a sledgehammer to it and throw it in the garbage, or really any of that kind of stuff. All of it is extremely immature. All of it is extremely insecure. And there's just nothing good that can come of you having these things at this point. So I think this whole idea of their new labeling program when it rolls out will be good, because it will give you some insight for the manufacturers that participate into, are the manufacturers of these devices taking privacy and security seriously? So it's a step in the right direction. But the only point I'm trying to make here is there is more information out there about this, but what I find in talking to people about this, businesses in particular, is they don't really take it seriously still until something bad happens to them. CISA has been pushing this idea, and this is something I'm a big fan of: secure by design, secure by default, right? They have a whole program built around this now, and the idea that all of these systems, whether it's your Ring doorbell, your Nest thermostat, some software you're using for your business, whatever, security should be baked into it by design. When you get it out and you start to use it, it should be secure by default. You shouldn't have to know how to configure it. You shouldn't have to know how to apply updates and that sort of stuff for it to be secure. So again, this would be an educational thing to try to help get the word out about, so that the people who are making these devices, the people who are making this software, are focused on security first. Just a couple more thoughts on that, and a little more definition around what does that really mean. But again, fundamentally, the idea that our whole society depends on this technology, we ought to be focused on security first, especially in light of all of the bad things that are currently happening in the world, and the fact that our enemies can leverage these tools to create devastating consequences. Another concept that's out there, again, sort of from the educational front: software bill of materials. And these two things, in my mind, work together, if for no other reason, just from a state perspective. When you're dealing with vendors trying to sell you stuff, right, trying to sell the state of Kentucky stuff, they should be held to these standards. Is the software that the state is buying secure by design and secure by default? Do you have a software bill of materials? In short, the whole idea, if you've ever worked in any kind of manufacturing environment, bill of materials tells you what's in something, right? I mean, that's the most basic layman's terms. Well, the whole idea that software would come with a bill of materials that tells you what's in it, right? This piece of software uses this other piece of software, which came from these people, right? Could it have problems in it? Maybe. How would I even know I have that? Because there's another piece of software I've used that relies on something that's buried deep down inside it. So this idea that there would be a bill of materials for all software, especially at a government level, it's extremely critical to make sure that you understand where something came from. Is it being maintained? And if it has a problem, what do you do about it, right? This is some information from the recent Microsoft Digital Defense Report. So now I'm going to kind of transition out of the education piece into some best practices ideas. And these best practices work for you as an individual, they work for you as a business, and they work for government organizations and these critical infrastructure agencies. So again, Microsoft, obviously they have some insight into this whole space. They're telling you here, if you just follow some basic cyber hygiene practices, right, and they show you 5 simple things, that will stop 99% of most attacks. Now, yeah, if China has decided to come after your specific water infrastructure, these might not be enough, right? You got to take a risk-based approach to this stuff. But simple things like multi-factor authentication, simple things like using strong, unique passwords on each account. Zero trust is a little more technical, a little nerdy. Keeping your software updated. There's so much of this stuff that is really very basic. Again, whether it's you as an individual, you as part of an organization, or you as a critical infrastructure agency, if these things were being done, you could significantly improve your security posture and vastly reduce the likelihood of something terrible happening. Hardening. So when you talk to nerds like me, hardening just means making your systems more difficult to hack. There's an enormous amount of guidance available out there right now. It kind of goes back to the conversation with the Chamber of Commerce there. There's an enormous amount of free information available from reputable organizations, whether it's NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or an organization like the Center for Internet Security. There's an enormous amount of information that businesses can use, that governments can use, that critical infrastructure agencies, the local power company can use to harden their systems. This costs nothing. It's crowdsourced information from experts that do this stuff every day. There's tons of this stuff out there. People just need to be made aware of it and then implement these things in their environment. Encryption. Encryption is something that cuts both ways, right? It gives you a way to protect your data. It also makes it easy for the bad guys to cover their tracks and destroy your data. But, part of that's secure by design, secure by default. We need encryption everywhere. Everything should be encrypted. Whether it's the data stored on your computer, the data stored on the state servers, the data stored inside some critical infrastructure agency, it should all be encrypted. We need to make that a standard as part of that idea of secure by design. Also getting back to this idea of readily available information that can help, whether it's the Kentucky state government or the local power agency or whatever, you have an enormous amount of security-oriented frameworks out there. I mean, these are well-vetted frameworks created by experts, again, places like the National Institute of Science and Technology, or Standards and Technology, rather, sorry, the Center for Internet Security. These are available now. You can download these things today as someone responsible for securing an environment and immediately put this stuff to work. It's all out there. It's all free. It costs nothing to use. You just need to know about it. So again, that idea of education and awareness about this, and then implementing these best practices and encouraging others to do it, which then kind of gets me to my last couple of points, right? Some incentives and some regulation that could potentially help drive some of these things, right? So in Ohio, they were the first state, and I live in Northern Kentucky. I spend a lot of time in Ohio, and I'm not here to tell you that Ohio is better than Kentucky. I'm a native, right? So don't misunderstand what I'm trying to go for here, but they've done some pretty innovative things in Ohio. Some things that I think we should strongly consider here. They created this safe harbor law in Ohio, and it basically says, from a cyber attack standpoint and a sort of a tortious liability standpoint for you as an organization, if you've done the right sort of things, you have some protection from liability. So, rather than get out the stick, it's a carrot approach, right? It's an incentive for a business to want to do the right thing. It also can help with things like your cyber insurance premiums as an organization. So, the idea that let's incentivize businesses to do the right thing because our entire society now depends on this, right? So that would be one thing I would encourage you all to take a hard look at. Ohio has created this idea of cyber reserve. As far as I know, I could not find any evidence of this in Kentucky. So this is literally something that runs out of their National Guard program in Ohio. People like me volunteer for this. And basically, you're providing lots of free advice and resources to the state of Ohio to help defend against this stuff, to work with people like Duke Energy and others to, try to help prevent some sort of catastrophic attack. If something like this exists in Kentucky, I apologize. I couldn't find it. I don't know why we wouldn't want to do something like this here. And I'll go on record right now. I would happily volunteer for something like this. And I know plenty of other people that would as well. And then to kind of wrap up here, Senate Bill 15. I had the pleasure to work with Senator Westerfield and McDaniel on this a little bit. I wouldn't say this bill is perfect, but I think it's a lot better than what we have now, which is nothing. And whether, again, it's sort of a combination of incentives and regulation, I think, we need to make sure we're creating an environment where businesses and organizations that have your data are protecting it and ultimately trying to make sure they're doing the right things to protect you as a consumer and, our society as a whole. So I'll kind of wrap up here with my buddy Mikko. I just can't state enough, as someone who has spent 30 plus years in the business and seeing devastating cyber attacks that in some cases are putting businesses out of business. Thankfully I haven't seen anything catastrophic from a societal standpoint yet, but it's hard for me to imagine that is not coming. Again, if you take a look at what folks like DHS through CISA are saying about infrastructure attacks and the need to tighten up the infrastructure, if we don't take this seriously and don't act aggressively, it's just going to be a matter of time. So I like to always end with this, the Frank's Red Hot lady, but think of it like security, right? You got to put that stuff on everything because we are in a place now where we all depend on this stuff. Here's some really useful Twitter accounts if you're interested at all in security, where you can get more information about this. Most of this is not super technical stuff, and it kind of keeps you apprised of what's happening out there. Here's a bunch of links to some of the stuff I talked about and some other stuff if you're interested in this that will be helpful. I'm happy to answer any questions. That's my tinfoil hat they made for me at the office, where my nickname is Doomsday Dave, by the way. And then to kind of close out there, so NSA Director General Paul Nakasone, cybersecurity is national security. Again, everything has software in it. We all depend on this. Our whole society now depends on this. We need to take this seriously. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I appreciate the opportunity to come down and talk to you all today. And I'm happy to help whenever, however I can. So,
Mayor Hatter, take a breath real quick.
it's hard. I get a little wrapped up.
You
on
know,
this.
your passion is amazing, and I will say, I loved everything until the part about the Roomba. The Roomba is probably the best thing for my marriage that maybe has ever. I love just hitting the button and it just works its magic on the floors around the house. So thank you.
Well, Senator Wise, have you seen the videos from the Roomba of people like in the toilet?
I don't want to see that video. No. I will say from someone who used to work for a 3-letter agency, I appreciate everything you're doing with this. I do want to ask, after 9/11, I want to say Department of Homeland Security put out a report that 85% of critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector. I never knew if that was fact or fiction. And with that, that does show, maybe if that's true, the difficulty we would have as government officials trying to tell private sector, if 85% of critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector, how difficult policy decisions can be made at a state level.
Yeah, Senator, I don't know if that number's right. I mean, I've heard similar numbers. I think if not 85%, it's a substantial percentage. And that's kind of why I'm trying to take the regulation, carrot, stick incentive approach. You know, some of it's education, some of it's trying to create an environment where there are incentives for folks to do the right thing. And then make sure they know what they should be doing, and then hopefully have significant consequences if they don't do it.
Absolutely. I do think Ohio, with what you mentioned there, it may be worth looking at our Kentucky Office of Homeland Security. I'm not for sure if they have dealt with this or are doing that, but that would be a good place maybe to start with them. We do have a question. Senator Wheeler?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I guess maybe to piggyback a little bit off of what you said, even if the critical infrastructure, 85% of it's owned by the private sector, I know we as the government do provide incentives and funding for a lot of that. I mean, most of the internet expansion in the Commonwealth is being funded by money we set aside that these contractors then use. Would you suggest attaching strings to that in order to make these companies eligible for these types of incentives to expand service?
I think because the risk is so high at this point. You know, think about it, Senator. If the power goes out for a substantial period of time, whether it's a cyber attack, EMP, whatever, that's going to be, your water is not going to show up anymore. There's all kinds of downstream consequences, right? Again, our entire digital society relies on electricity. If the electrical grid is not secure for whatever reason, that's a huge potential problem. So, you know, to the extent there could be incentives through grants or whatever, at this point, I think it's absolutely critical that we look at those kind of things. And then I would say just for these rural agencies that, you know, local communities that have their own water plants and that sort of thing, I think there's enormous risk there because I'm sure most of them are not really considering the sort of stuff we talked about
If
today.
you'll indulge, you brought up another very good point. You know, water plants or even, you know, a lot of these government-funded solar projects we're seeing now, most of those components are made in the People's Republic of China, and yet we're paying to put them and integrate them into our electric system. And I heard all these panels, a lot of them are attached to the internet and Wi-Fi so that they're right into the World Wide Web. To what extent could we promote policies to decouple from China to kind of, you know, maybe bring about a little bit more security here in the homeland?
Well, as you may know, Senator, you know, Huawei and other Chinese vendors of telecom equipment have been banned. I think that's a legitimate concern. Now, you know, a lot of the more advanced chips we can only make in the United States at this point, but I know this sounds far-fetched to people, and I'm not a hardware expert. I'm more of a software guy. But it's entirely possible that if you're buying chips from a foreign adversary, those chips could have a back door in them. That is not impossible by any stretch.
Who would
and,
even think?
you know, could they be remotely turned off at some point? I mean, you saw that story about the Schneider power meters and the possibility of power outages as a result there. So, I mean, that's not some sort of tinfoil hat conspiracy. That's where we're at with this technology at this point. And yes, decoupling our infrastructure from equipment made in adversarial nations, I think would be a very smart move, however we get there.
And then you brought up autonomous vehicles. That was a topic of great discussion. I was adamantly opposed, but you know, I actually just met with a representative from a firm proposing this long term, and last year I had gotten an amendment at least to up the liability for these vehicles given the type of damage that it might cause. But they said that they frankly acknowledged that they were going to be against that this year because their long-term goal was no more car ownership. You just basically pushed a button on your phone and something shows up at your house, which I just thought was terrifying, frankly.
I would agree with you 100% on that. It's almost like Rush predicted that with the song Red Barchetta back in the 70s, but what do I know? You know? Yeah, thanks, but I'll drive myself. Yeah.
Thank you. You had a very informative presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Wheeler. Mayor Hatter, I see no further questions. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the information. I will be calling you as a guest speaker to my terrorism studies class in the near future. So thank you so much.
I would be happy to come, Senator. Thank you.
Do we have a motion for adjournment? So moved. Thank you all. See you next month.